And we are back. You are chatting with John P. Today, we are going to be talking about 5 vintage watch considerations. Now, as a watch dealer with delraywatch.com, we do handle vintage watches from time to time, and we also have a service center, of course, where we do service a lot of vintage watches, and that's going to be one of the things on the list. But there are some things, some little nuances, not necessarily bad things, but little intricacies and certainly things that you need to consider before buying or owning a vintage watch that you may have not considered otherwise. But if you're new to the channel, please like and subscribe. It does help me a lot. You know, the higher on that list that I get, the more of you I can reach, the more of you I can talk with. And if you leave in the comments below, I make sure to answer most of the questions because I really do appreciate you being here with me. And today on the wrist, I have this really interesting Cuervo y Sobrinos full diamond encrusted watch that Federico thought would be a great idea to pick up. I'll admit, it's not my cup of tea with the diamonds, but as far as the complications, it's got a jump hour and some other interesting things. You should check that out at delraywatch.com because this is such an interesting piece. And if you like a little bit of bling, we don't get a lot of these on our website, so now is your chance to get a steal on the bling. Ballin' on a budget, as they call it, delraywatch.com. And you can find me on Instagram, TheRealJohnP. Running into the list before I get attacked for not doing so, the first thing that you need to consider is timekeeping with vintage watches. With watches in general, you know, you can get to COSC certification. Generally with modern watches, no problem. Chronometer specs, you know, within a few seconds per day. With modern, you can do it no problem, even if it's not certified. But when we're talking about vintage, time has gone on, you know, the elements of time have really worn down on the watch. Things such as the gears on the inside and sometimes levers, they start wearing down, and because of that, there's much more variance in the timekeeping. Now, depending on the temperature and where you wear the watches, as well as how you wear them, the position of your hand, if it's on your desk, if it's moving around, there's a lot of variance when it comes to vintage watches and keeping time. And to keep chronometer specs for a watch that's over 30 years old, in my opinion, is very unreasonable, and including the opinion of most people in the industry. Now, that's not saying that it's impossible, because if you replace enough parts, or perhaps the watch was never really worn and sat in a safe, a bit of a safe queen, yeah, sure, you can get chronometer specs. But I think for vintage watches, plus minus 14 seconds is more than advantageous. I mean, that's AP's standard for most of their watches out there in the field. But if you can get it within plus minus 20 for a vintage watch, especially a much older watch or a vintage chronograph, I think that you're not in a bad spot, especially if it's not your everyday wear. In my experience and the experience with our service center, it seems like Rolex is a little bit better when it comes to this. Their movements are a little bit more time-tested and true, and, you know, for whatever reason, they just have been able to age a little bit better. The quality, you know, at a 40-year-old watch, Rolex was doing a little bit better. You know, there's primitive, simple movements, and they tend to be a little bit better as far as timekeeping, but generally, you know, please don't expect a 50-year-old watch to keep chronometer specs every time, or not even, you know, most of the time for that matter. So, the next item or consideration for vintage watches is the quality. Now, when we're talking about a 50-year-old watch, you can't just put that up into a modern day watch, or even a watch that's 10, 20 years old, and expect the quality to be on par with each other. It's just not reasonable. If you have a modern Datejust, there's been years and years of technological advancements that have caught up and pushed and propelled the watchmaking industry forward. And when we're talking about a vintage watch, you know, the tooling and the processes were much more primitive. So, you know, it's really unreasonable to compare a modern and vintage and expect the same quality. And a lot of you guys out there are watch geeks like myself, watch collectors. You've been doing this a while. It might not be you, but if you're newer to the hobby, it's fair to say, and I think it's decent advice to say, you know, go for vintage if you like the art behind it, you like the design, you like more than just the quality, because it's not always the case. And modern will outperform and out quality vintage almost every time. The next item is that parts can oftentimes be difficult to source. When we're talking about certain vintage watches, in vintage watch movements, something like a Valjoux 72, even when they used, variations of it for early Rolex chronographs and cosmographs. Parts can be very difficult to source, especially if the parts aren't produced anymore, or if the demand has gotten so high that there's people that actually stockpile these parts, like the 72. Parts can be very difficult to source. Now, when this happens, the repair bill does go up, I'll say, because parts actually have to be created. So if you have a watch that needs a part, it's broken, it doesn't tick, and you can't replace it with something else that exists, either it's out of production or the part cannot be found, well, the part has to be made. And there's watchmakers, much like Hans that we have at delraywatch.com when we do servicing and restoration and repairs, rather, we actually will create the part for you. There's specific tooling procedures and ways of metalworking that only the most classically trained, skilled watchmakers and craftsmen can do, and it is really rare to find watchmakers that can do that and also want to do that because, one, you need the experience, two, it's a very delicate procedure, and it's very precise. I mean, these parts are being created with pieces of metal and files, and oftentimes from scratch, and sometimes other parts that exist that float around that are modified, similar gears, toothed or something like that, reteethed. So it's very difficult. It's hard to find these watchmakers. We're very fortunate to have Hans, but that's something to consider that, when you buy a vintage watch, especially an older vintage chronograph, consider that if you have to send it in, the parts might not be available, and that could send the repair bill going through the roof if a part has to be actually created from scratch. Now this one, on the list, a consideration for vintage watches is water. Now, I hate to say that vintage watches are not for the active guy because you don't necessarily need to be going in water to be considered an active guy. But down here in Miami, I really do see a lot of vintage subs, relatively speaking. And I wouldn't recommend swimming with the vintage Submariner. And it's not that the case just can't handle it anymore because, properly maintained for all those years, properly handled, checking the seals, the pressure resistance, all of that, sure, you probably can get it to be watertight, but why risk it? Stepping outside of the Rolex Oyster case, vintage watches, especially vintage dress watches, which in earlier times, that's what most people wanted to wear, gold dress watches. These were just not made to be submersed in water. Oftentimes in the past, people would take off their watch, take off their vintage Vacheron or vintage Patek, and then they would even wash their hands. And so sure, maybe you can get a little bit of water on it, but in terms of, actually taking some of those watches into the water or on the beach, I wouldn't recommend it because not only was the water resistance for non-Rolex Oyster case, the ratings back then just not as good as it is today, the cases have gone ahead and been weathered. The seals are probably not intact for most watches out there that have not been properly taken care of. And when you damage a vintage watch, first of all, you'll never get another dial for it, probably. And if you have any kind of rust on the parts, a watchmaker actually has to scrape off the rust, and that's going to mess with the timekeeping, so you're probably not likely to wear a watch that's not keeping somewhat acceptable time. It's just kind of a headache. So if you can stay away from water with vintage watches, everyone in the industry is going to recommend that, and a lot of collectors will as well. So stay away from the water if you can, and that's something to consider for vintage watches. And lastly, you need to watch out for modifications on vintage watches. There are some modifications like dial swaps, caseback swaps, crown swaps, and reattaching the lugs that are very difficult even for some dealers to detect. If you swap a dial on a watch that was not in maybe was not in production in high volumes in earlier times. Not saying, necessarily a vintage Datejust or a Submariner, but, something like a vintage Vacheron, a vintage Patek. It can be very difficult to determine if that watch actually shipped with that dial unless it's completely out of place because there's just not a lot of documentation and a lot of the dials look a lot the same, and it's a lot more difficult considering a lot of brands didn't have reference numbers in vintage times. They kind of just had, somewhat generic dress watches, and so dial swaps are very difficult to find. If there's some wiggling in the case, the dial is probably not for that case. I mean, there could be something else that's wrong, like a retention ring or something else, but Generally, if there's a little bit of a play in there, the dial's probably not for the case. If you see a gap, it's not for the case. If the metal on the hour markers does not match the case material, there's a good chance the dial's not for that case, but not always. So you need to be careful with that. The Caseback, you even see this sometimes pretty common with Omegas, is there on vintage Omegas, for example, there should be a reference number stamped on the inside of the Caseback, and a lot of times a Caseback gets damaged, or either the threading, or it's dented, or there was an engraving on the back and it'll get swapped out, and the reference number will not match the watch, especially if it's a more rare reference, like a vintage Seamaster with the rotating bezel. I think like a 165.024 or some reference like that. So you need to be careful with the Casebacks. Do look at the Casebacks. That tricks a lot of people. The dial, of course, the crown. Now, the crowns can be so tricky because there's so many spare surplus crowns floating around that just because it has the brand name on it, it doesn't necessarily mean it's for the watch. So you need to find a known good example of the watch to make sure the crown is good for it. If the crown looks too big or too small, it's probably not right. If it doesn't close all the way, it's probably not right. And also, if it doesn't have a brand logo on it, unless it's very, very old, like maybe older than 50 years, it's probably also not for the watch. So make sure the crown's signed. A lot of crowns fall off and they were replaced because the watch just wasn't worth as much in the past before the vintage watch craze. So do look at the crowns, because that's also another problem as well. Even if it's a solid gold watch and there's a gold-plated crown for that example, try to stick to those original crowns if you can. And the retouched lugs, I see this so often with vintage Pateks that are lower priced. You know, we'll get an email from a guy, says, hey, what do you think about this vintage Patek? Now, we don't always give out consulting, but sometimes, you know, if we have a few minutes to spare, I like, you know, helping out where I can. And I'll see a picture, and you look on the flip side of the case, and you can see very clearly that the lugs have been reattached. And, you know, in the world of vintage watches, there are a lot of Frankens, a lot of put-together pieces and parts, and look for the reattached lugs, because, you know, sometimes the lugs become, you know, unattached and they're put back together, and I don't have a great reason for that other than somehow it cracked or fell off. I don't know. Leave in the comments below if you actually ever had to have your lugs attached. I would like to know why. And also, leave in the comments below if there's any other considerations that you might be considering when you're purchasing vintage watches that you'd like to share with others in the comments. I can think of a few more, but I wanted to compile the top 5 considerations for vintage watches. Hopefully it helps some of you that are new to vintage watches, or maybe in modern getting into vintage, or maybe if you've been around for a while, this is just a good refresher, because hey, it's always fun to talk about these things, right? And also, do not forget to check out delraywatch.com, where you can see this crazy, interesting Cuervo y Sobrinos blinged out, fully diamond crusted watch. It's a sight to look at, you know, nonetheless. So please check that out. Like and subscribe. You know the drill. You have been chatting with John P. Ciao.